I think you're really going to enjoy my interview with Holly Forman Patel. I've been working with her for a lot of years, so it's so exciting to always hear how clinicians and healers are growing and changing their techniques. And so, one of the things that Holly's working on now is the whole idea about hypnosis and sort of the deeper changes that people might want to make if they're having like reoccurring issues like flashbacks or dissociations and really wanting to solve those. I love her concept of dissociation. Not that I love her concept because it's like just a main definition. Let me pause right there. So the concept of dissociation that she educates us about is really important to remember. Is sometimes dissociation is normal and it's healthy. It's like you want to dissociate during a really hard injury because you don't want to feel it so much, you don't want to remember it. The body does it as a protective measure, so does the mind. And sometimes we've had a really hard day, so we can't help but dissociate. Like we're like, how did we get home? Oh yeah, we drove ourselves, but it was a really overwhelming day and you were like in your head on the way home. But the other part is that sometimes dissociation is really not helpful at all, and it might cause damage. Like, for example, people that might have issues of impulsivity and addiction, like not being able to stop eating and not knowing that they are, or not being able to stop drinking, not really having that switch engaged, like that was enough, or I'm even aware. So that would be times where you really want to disrupt that pattern and really build other coping mechanisms. And also building other healthier coping mechanisms as we go through life is also critical. I love the thought of that there are specific clinicians for specific things, and that we all sort of take time in some ways to sort of hypnotize ourselves around different things, like things that we want to do or don't want to do. And it's when that gets really obvious and really gets to be a disconnection that we want to examine it. It's so important that you, as a clinician, and you, if you're a person that's just listening for education, educate yourself about the best ways to help yourself. Always, 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 because there's lots of modalities out there and there's lots of cures, right? But to understand what's going to like fit you just right in terms of what you're struggling with is critical. So I hope that you find this informative, just like I did. Always a pleasure to talk to Holly Foreman. She's so educating herself constantly and evolving as a therapist. I love to share her information with you. And so looking forward to always doing that ever so often. Okay, hope you enjoyed that interview. So, Holly, I'm so glad we're back talking again, because I know you and I have been working with healing people for many, many years, and we're always talking about what's the next part of our work that we're doing. And one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to talk to you again on my podcast was to talk about some of the healing that you're doing with people these days, and sort of the pulse that you have on what people are needing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's lovely seeing you again as well. And you might have noticed this yourself, but people are really stressed right now. There is so much going on in the world. It seems like anxiety is at, I think, an all-time high, not just post-pandemic, but with world events and what have you. And what can happen is these current events can trigger past experiences that someone has had and can
Mhm.
actually make it so what's happening in the present now is making them more anxious because of their past experiences. And so that's what I'm seeing happening in my practice most right now. And I find that if we can start addressing some of those past experiences, it actually helps people be more resilient in the now, and it helps them respond to all these things happening in the world that we don't have control over.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's well, there's no accident that we're saying that on today's date, which is the election in the US. And just thinking about this whole idea is like sometimes there's this whole thought of if you can't be in that moment of acceptance of what the struggle is or what the anxiety is that you're having, to get through that next moment, and to accept that maybe there isn't anything you actually can do with that moment except for be with it. And I agree with you on that. that idea of that the past is feeding the present all the time.
Yeah.
I was recently thinking a lot about dissociation and lashing out, like how people, when they feel really stressed, they're not even present and they just are maybe blindly, like not even knowing that they're coming across really harshly or something. And someone else was telling me, people are just walking around grumpy right now, you know, agitated and grumpy. So where should we go from here to kind of like talking about healing things or healing concepts that you and I, how you understand these things?
Yeah, and so, no surprise to you, one of my favorite things to do is utilize EMDR therapy, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And that's a really fantastic therapy that helps reprocess those past events. But I hear you say the words dissociation, and over the last few years, I personally love training, so I take lots of advanced trainings. And I was finding in my practice that even with EMDR therapy, which really, can get at those past events, if someone has a lot of attachment challenges that have happened to them, or if they maybe dissociate a little more than the average person, it can kind of stall things. And not just in EMDR therapy, but in any type of therapy a therapist does. And this impacts the client, in their everyday life. And so I got trained in a couple more therapies that I now weave in a little more with that. And so one of them is hypnosis, which I feel like is a very old school therapy that's been around for a really long time. And then
Mhm.
the other one is ego state therapy, which is a type of parts work. And so I find when a memory is not resolving more traditionally, it's usually because there are some parts at play. And
Mhm.
people get nervous when they hear parts sometimes because they're like, oh no, you think I'm crazy. And, I have different parts of myself. We used to call it, multiple personality disorder. Now it's called dissociative identity disorder. But what people don't realize is that dissociation is a continuum and we all dissociate because it's a way for us to protect ourselves.
Mhm.
And so there's lots of normal dissociation. I always use normal in quotations because what does normal actually mean? But if you have a bad day at work and suddenly you get in your car and you find yourself in front of your house and you're like, oh wait, I don't remember going past that busy stoplight. You were mildly dissociating. And so it's actually a way that we protect ourselves.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
challenge is if we've gotten so used to protecting ourselves that way, we haven't learned maybe some bigger coping skills that we could use that might be more beneficial. And so pairing hypnosis with ego state therapy can really help get under what's going on. And dissociation is a type of trance. And so in hypnosis, we go into trance, and people always get a little nervous about that because we see these stage hypnotists, make people cluck like chickens and stuff. Um, but in the end, you can't be hypnotized unless you don't want to. So what those stage hypnotists do is they actually do a group exercise first. And so they watch the entire room and they engage the whole room in a group exercise and they watch to see which person is the most hypnotizable. And those are the people that are 100% on board. Those are the people you can make cluck like a chicken because they want to. And so the stage hypnotist watches those people and then he chooses them to go up on stage and do the experiential.
Mhm.
You can't be hypnotized unless you don't want to. And the way I describe it is you just kind of go into like a deep meditative state and you're very conscious. There's this idea that you're unconscious with it, but you're not.
Mhm.
And so when we're in a trance state, we're actually more susceptible to suggestions, what we call unconscious suggestions.
Right.
So if we're given a suggestion in trance and it aligns with what we're okay with, we're more likely to be able to take that into our everyday life. And we're giving ourselves unconscious suggestions all the time and don't even realize it. When you're on TikTok and you go into that TikTok zone, you actually get yourself into a trance state. And then depending on what you're watching, you're more susceptible to those videos. We could say things to ourselves like, oh, if my phone keeps dying from battery, I'm like, oh, don't forget to charge your phone. If I keep saying to myself, don't forget to charge your phone, don't forget to charge your phone, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to forget to charge my phone. And so if we just change our language and say something like, oh, make sure to charge your phone, we're actually more likely to do that.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to go back and kind of decipher some of these things just for
Yeah.
people. So the idea about dissociation, um, I think it's a really important concept for people to know that there's all different ways to dissociate, and maybe you could give us a few more examples of like people might find themselves doing X.
Yeah. So eating, like overeating, is a really common one where you're having a stressful day, you come home, you grab those bag of Doritos, and then you just start eating, right? Maybe you're watching TV and then you look down and you're like, holy moly, half the bag is gone. How did that happen? So that's a way in which we can do it. And I mentioned that continuum. So on this far end is where we get, a complete split of a personality. But most of us are going to be, in the first half of that. We might dissociate in our experiences of how we're showing up in the world. We might not notice that we're engaging in other behaviors, even interpersonally with our kids, with our partners. And then we might become surprised when they say, oh, remember when you were doing this? And we're like, I had no clue I did that. So it can show up in a lot of different ways for people. It really just kind of depends.
Hmm. Yeah, so when people come in and they might notice that they notice that they're dissociating, or you feel like somehow it's you are finding out about it or they are finding out about it, because in a way it's like, not we don't want to do that secret, like, oh, you don't know these parts of yourself, you don't know who you are. I mean, that's kind of a scary thought, but sometimes the things that you might hear or be afraid of about yourself is the things that you really need to understand about yourself, like why you do that.
Yeah.
I know when I was working on like understanding my relationship with money, I realized like when I was at the cash register, I would forget how I paid. Like, did I pay cash? Did I pay my card? I mean, of course, I could figure it out once I wasn't dissociated, but it was this thing like I really needed to figure out why that moment was challenging to me or stressful to me, right? And then once I did, I'm like was very attentive to that. Almost like that thing, like what you just said around don't forget to charge your phone, don't forget to charge your phone. It's like you might say like, you know is there enough money in your bank, is there enough money in your card, like what's going on, like maybe that nervous moment is like I'm just going to space out right there because I don't know.
Yes. Usually, oftentimes, where there's something that's happening right before the dissociation occurs that we're perhaps avoiding. So maybe you were supposed to go check that bank account to see what you have, and then you find yourself eating the bag of chips or what have you. And
Right.
so what I talk with clients about is like, for one, it's normal. People
Mhm.
get afraid of the dissociation word, but it's super normal. But we want to start gaining awareness around it. When is it happening? And then we want to start rolling it back and seeing what's happening right before I go into that behavior. So as
Right.
we're going to go, pay at the check stand, what was happening right before that? Was it fear around what was in the bank account? I don't know for you, but I'm just giving
Yeah.
examples. It's like, what is
Yeah.
the thing
Mhm.
that's happening? And then if we can sit with it and really feel what's going on and then address it, that's how we can start shifting the behavior.
Well, I think a lot of it, just to go back to that example, is the way our society is a little set up, just like with the phone, that we get completely overstimulated. So you might go into the store, the next when you leave the store, you're like, why the heck did I buy all this stuff? Like I didn't need. It was like, oh, 2 for 1, and this is like marked down like 75% off, and so it probably was, and I'm sure I knew it at the time when I was working out the dissociation, was maybe you can't afford and you shouldn't be buying all this stuff. And this person at the cash register is going to tell you, like, you can't afford it. Like you bought way too much stuff, then, in your account is whatever going to overdraw, whatever it is, in the days that you could just like put a check through, right? Um, but I also think about there's a lot of fear that comes before dissociation, right? So my other dissociative example, which I think you could analyze for us, is I had a very curious kid who was very brave and did things like, like I used to call them like, please don't give the moms a heart attack on in the playground, because they would climb the highest tree, sort of thing. But I remember the moms being like, your kid's in the highest part of that tree and they're gonna fall, he's gonna fall. And I would say, oh, well, if you hear don't fall, right? You're going to fall,
Yep.
right? And I
Yep.
would just yell out, strong legs, you know,
I
because
love
I
it.
just was like, I can't handle both fears, the fears of the
Yeah.
group, fears of the child, right? But I
Mhm.
think that is the thing, is that a lot of times there's a fear-based response that we get, and that makes us dissociate, like the fear of, um, not having enough money, or the fear of the fall. And then when the fear comes over you, then the trance dissociative state comes, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Am I making sense with how I'm thinking about it?
No, that makes sense. The strong legs, though, is a unconscious suggestion that you gave your son, which is really great in those
Mhm.
situations. And I'm going to give another example of really what we call, normal dissociation is when we get hurt, right? When we have significant injuries, suddenly we feel our bodies numb, right? We might feel a little distant from it all. That is a protective way that we dissociate. So in of itself, it's not a problem, right? It can be actually very helpful. If you
Right,
think about trauma for young kids, I'm really happy they dissociated during that trauma. But it becomes a challenge when that's the coping skill we use to get through life,
right.
like when fear or certain emotions come up.
Right, or accident time. I always think about when, if ever you've been in a car accident, or hopefully it wasn't an accident, it was just a bumper to bumper hit. There is this like very slow time thing. Time takes a different pace, but then getting stuck in that stops you from having the right reflex, right?
Yeah.
That's where you want to start correcting it, or the person might feel like, I've got to do something else aside not be able to drive.
Right. And that's where it gets more unhealthy, right? And you hear of people. I remember as a kid watching some talk show, and there's a woman who could only make left turns. And they were talking about how hard this was for her. And it had to do with an accident, making a right turn. And I'm like, can you imagine living your life only making left turns?
I
That'd be hard.
think they have a thing on the GPS for that, like only turns.
Oh, do they?
So some of this is like you get, so this is the parts thing that you're talking about, is that, and then there's another part of you that's kind of undeveloped there and stuck there, and you have to, what, understand that part, give it another voice, or what would you
You know,
say?
yeah, it really depends on, the situation that's happening. But again, it's around building insight. And whenever we're conflicted, usually there's different parts of ourselves,
Mhm.
right? So we have Susan, you and I have our therapist part, right? We have our partner part, you have a mom part. But if we have some stuff from childhood, we might have these other maybe younger parts that can come into play. I'm a trainer for EMDR, and when I was first becoming a trainer years ago, there was a little part of me that would suddenly get scared presenting in a big room of people. And it
Mhm.
was like young perfectionist part that I personally had to work through.
Mhm.
And there's all sorts of things you can do. And one of them is you can thank the part for how it's helped you. And then you can, find a new job or let it retire. And so with some young parts, like I took this from a therapist named Shirley Jean Schmidt that talks about this, where you can actually create a place for that part to go and play. And so that part can go off and live its life now. It doesn't have to do the thing that it has done for you so long in life.
I like that. That is a really great visual of a coping skill, of like, that young part doesn't have to find the coping skill. They can actually just go off and do what that part should have been doing, instead of
Exactly.
doing the thing that they couldn't do, right?
Yep.
And that would be like why the perfectionism came in. Is like, you have to be able to do this really well, or you're failing, or something like that, where that part shouldn't have been doing that anyway, right?
Exactly.
It shouldn't have been showing up at the big talk as an adult.
Right. Yeah,
Or-
that's
yeah,
scary.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
What's the difference between the ego state therapy and internal family systems?
Mm. Um, so a
And
lot
describe both so people understand.
So internal family systems, or IFS, took a lot of its stuff from ego state therapy, right? Therapies we love to borrow from each other.
Mhm.
But in my understanding of IFS, and to be clear, I've only had a few trainings in it, and most of my trainings in ego state therapy is a little more structured. And there's a naming of parts that happen. There's a perpetrator part and a firefighter part. Whereas ego state, it's a bit more fluid. And I personally prefer ego state therapy because I tend to work with a lot of clients who, we think about that continuum, are actually at the end of it. And so there, we don't want to name parts of self when we're doing that because it can actually create more fragmentation.
Mhm. So
But
let's talk about that in a way for the people who aren't the therapists in that are
yeah,
listening. So because if you're seeking therapy,
yeah.
or seeking to do a work on yourself, like how would you know, um, whether you would choose EMDR, hypnosis, or I mean, maybe your therapist would, or if you don't have a therapist, should be like, hey, I'm struggling with this. I'd really like to figure out how to get through it. And thinking about ego state, internal family systems, like
Yeah.
let's try to educate people about those things. I think that's an important point. There's so many therapies out there.
Yes, and there's lots of different ways to resolve our past experiences. And so for EMDR therapy, when you have memories that when you think about them right now and you feel a charge, EMDR therapy will be helpful. Or if you have those memories that you are purposely avoiding because it feels too intense to
Give
let.
me a common example of like, this is perfect. Like, this is a really common issue that people have. This is a really efficient way to solve it. EMDR.
So, if someone's having flashbacks, do you ever watch the news and someone will be like, this one memory has haunted me for 20 years? That
Mhm.
is ridiculous, super unnecessary. And so, really, anytime you are bothered by a past experience, the challenge though is sometimes we're bothered by a past experience, but we don't know that. We've done such a good time dissociating from it to
Mhm.
protect ourselves and avoiding it. So,
Right.
EMDR therapy can be very helpful for that too, but sometimes we don't know that's happening if that makes sense. But
Yeah.
really, it's for resolving past memories. So if you have
Right.
those things, I know you specialize in working with divorce. There are so many clients that went through terrible divorces and they're reminded of this divorce all the time, right? And they might have triggers to text messages or what have you. You can use EMDR therapy to resolve those divorce memories. And it can be really powerful. So you get that
Right.
text from your ex and it's not bothersome. So that's what
Right.
EMDR is really helpful with. I find ego state and IFS, I'll group them together because they're both parts work. That can be work really well when there are lots of internal conflicts happening. Right? Oh, I'm doing this thing, but I want to be doing this thing, or I find myself doing this behavior, but I want to be doing this instead. That's when I find ego state and IFS can be really helpful.
Okay. So it's almost like that's when the younger part's retiring and the other part is starting to come in. Like, let's look at who you are today and why you're not being able to go to the places and you're still stuck in these parts of yourself of the past. Like that's more of the ego state. Okay.
And
Great.
I find EMDR therapy with a therapist who is trained in a types of parts therapy, whether it's ego state or IFS, works beautifully. Because too many times I see clients working with a therapist on one issue, but then they need help with this other thing and have to see two therapists at once. So if you can get someone that does multiple modalities like that, it can be really beneficial.
Great. Okay. And then the ego state is sort of similar to the IFS. So that would be sort of just depending on what your preference is in a way.
Exactly. And IFS has all the buzz these days, so people are going towards it.
Yes.
But most of it's based off of ego state therapy, so I'm a
Right.
little preferent
Right.
for that. Yeah.
And some of the ways that just to, you said something about the divorce specialty. Some of the ways that I've changed the way I work with people is I look at, relationships are such a big part of our lives, like our connection with people in general and if we are in partnerships, who they are, and if they end, what happens to us and how can we move on. So I always think now that I'm not so much doing the divorce work as much as I'm doing the transformation work, which is what's your next chapter going to be like? And then what in your next chapter, what are you going to bump into that you have to heal from your
Mhm.
last chapter? Kind of like ego states in a way, like we got to retire some of those old parts because maybe you're with another person or actually you're fine being on your own. And like, how are you going to really start almost doing life design on your new chapter? Like,
Yeah,
what do you want now? Because a lot of times we as human beings go through many decades kind of being the same way, and you and I know because we're in the business of change, right? Is that it's really hard to change.
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
people who are coming in to even listen to this talk are really thinking about, I want to change parts of myself. I want to live the vision of my life that I want, but how can I do that? So that's why it's so great to talk to you and to hear the things that you're doing because you're adding more. more diversity and varieties of ways that you can do that. So you don't have to stay stuck in these places that aren't helpful, or it's like, that's holding me back, or I am so held back.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not needed, but there can be parts of self that are afraid to change. And so that's something that can be addressed.
Mhm. What do you feel like is the thing that's been the most called on by community or by people that come to seek you out that they're really needing these days? I mean, we talked about things being at unrest in the world, but are
Yeah.
you feeling like you've had to change the way that you work, or you've had to actually do some of your own practices for yourself to adapt and adjust to the way that you're a therapist now, as opposed to how you were 4 years ago when we probably did this talk 4 years ago?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the world's changed so much. The interesting thing is that I was already gearing up to go full telehealth, which I still am. And I know there's a lot of therapists who are going back and maybe doing hybrids. But I love telehealth. And not, I don't think I'll change anytime soon. You know, I'm in socks right now, which I absolutely love. Not a fan of shoes, which is a little more awkward when you're in person if you're doing that as a therapist. But I found that, outside of like specifics, like making sure the person has a computer where they can see you and good internet,
Right.
um, I really actually love my practice
Mm.
now versus even 5 years ago in a much different way.
Mhm. Yeah, so it's more convenient, you're more comfortable, you can do
Yeah.
better work, you can get the education you need and want. So things have been just a little bit more convenient maybe to do the work that you
Yes,
do.
absolutely. And I have found that there's some really cool things that can happen in telehealth. I have clients who will have their dog on their lap as they're processing past memories.
Mhm.
They can easily show me, a picture that was taken that they just put on their desk. It gives me more insight into their world, which I wouldn't have gotten if a client was just coming in person. Now I don't get to see, the second half of their body, which is a bit of a bummer. But there are these other things that have really been added due to telehealth.
Mhm. No, agreed. And I remember back the days of going to the office myself and going to a few offices and really feeling like it's kind of uncomfortable for people to come in and have their 15 minutes and maybe get upset, and then they have to kind of go out into the world, and I have to tell them they have to go and have my next client and shift out. And so there's a lot of like, wow, that was really hard on people in a lot of ways to,
Absolutely. To
yeah, to
drive
have,
home.
yeah, to put themselves back together. Hmm.
Absolutely. We're doing it at home can feel a little nicer. And
Right.
you also don't have clients like awkwardly walking past each other, sitting next to each other. I think there's a little shift with confidentiality. And I do think more people are coming who wouldn't have come before because they didn't
Right.
want to park in front of a therapy office and maybe have people know. Even though I do think the stigmatization is coming down, which is great,
Mhm.
there's still just something nice for it feeling a little more confidential for people.
Mhm. I agree. I think there's the pros and cons, and I think also every once in a while to be sitting in a room. I know for me, every chance I get when I go back to the Bay to sit in a room with somebody if I can, to let them meet me for the first time in person is
Absolutely.
also a really dimensional experience that
Oh,
I
yeah.
appreciate a lot. So
Definitely. I went back over the summer to the Bay for because most of my clients are still in California, a huge percent in the Bay Area, and saw people in person for 2 weeks. And some people who I had already met me in person, others who hadn't. And it was a really fun experience. So you're right. Like at least having a couple touch points can be super beneficial.
yes. So, tell us a little bit more about if you were going to do hypnosis with somebody, or
Yeah.
how would you prepare them? What would the session look like? What would they, how would they set themselves up to be like, okay, this is the piece I'm working on?
It's not any different than any other therapy that you do. And so when you're going into trance state, you always have an intention of what is the purpose of this?
Mhm.
And so, is the purpose to gain insight into, the part of myself that's overeating those Doritos versus the part that actually wishes I got home and got on my Peloton. And so exploration of parts can be really helpful. So that would be an intention. The other
Mhm.
thing I love to do with hypnosis is just building a resource. So when we might need maybe a part of ourself needs a resource, I so one thing that I actually have added to my practice over the last 4 or 5 years is working more with like elite performers, be it athletes or other people that are just performing in these different realms, and so creating visualizations of what they might need to go up on stage and do that thing, to go out on the football field. And so creating some of those visualizations, you don't need hypnosis for it, but hypnosis can just enhance it ever so slightly. So those are
Yeah.
some ways I use it. Yeah. But just like with any therapy space, having a space that's all your own, that's not going to be impact, others aren't walking in the room. But outside of that, it's the same that you would with any type of therapy.
Right, right. Well, because I remember when I first heard about hypnosis, it was in the Bay Area, and there was like this one guy in the Bay Area that was hypnotizing all the people that wanted to quit smoking. And
Um,
he was like, 3 sessions for $100 and you'll be done.
yeah.
And I thought that was a really, I got to know him, actually worked in the building that we shared.
Oh,
Um, and actually, no, not the Sutter Street one.
oh
And
yeah.
um, and so it was really interesting to just see that he like got in there, got people to achieve that goal, and
Yes.
inserted the visuals, inserted the suggestions. And
Yes.
it wasn't a you're never going to come out of it. You're going to be clucking like a chicken. It wasn't like that. It was actually like you're just going to get more resourced. And then if you need that resource to be more strengthened, then you come back for the second and third time.
Yes, and people respond really well to quitting smoking with hypnosis. There's lots of good research around
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So interesting. So and most people think like you're not going to be able to switch out of that state very easily. But
Um,
the process is you take them into the state, right?
yep,
And you take them out of the state, right?
absolutely. Yep.
With
So you do what's called an elicitation. And there's lots of different ways. Sometimes in the media we hear counting back from 10, imagining going downstairs. You can even do, things with fingers where you slowly watch your fingers come together and then you deepen into a trance. So there's lots of different ways to go into it. And then you bring the person out of it.
and
Um,
for you, I mean, usually as therapists, we try everything that we do, right? Usually.
Absolutely,
So
yes.
you tried the difference between EMDR and hypnosis for you and your experience. Like, how did that feel embodied?
Yeah, so EMDR was really around for processing past trauma. And that can bring up lots of big emotions. So I find EMDR therapy is going to elicit way more emotions than hypnosis will.
Uh-huh.
Whereas I did a little bit of hypnosis on some sleep stuff a few years ago. And so they're very different intentions, right? Now, if I had trauma memories related to challenges sleeping, then I would have done EMDR therapy. But there was nothing like that. And so instead, I did some hypnosis that just adds and strengthens some suggestions for you for sleeping.
Hmm. Great. Okay, good. Anything else you feel like you want to share with us before we end, or
No,
insights?
yeah, I think we covered a lot of good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Well, I guess the words of wisdom, maybe, and maybe you can add to that, is
Um,
the development of different coping skills if you feel stuck.
yes.
That there's different modalities of therapy to get to the deeper parts of why you might be not changing or having the life that you want. Because maybe there needs to be like, hey, I just seem to be stuck in this memory. And every
Yeah.
time I do this X, this memory comes up, or I only can take lefts, or whatever it is, it's holding me back, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the main thing is that we don't have to be stuck in whatever we feel like we're stuck in, is that there is hope. There's so many different therapies that can address whatever's going on. The bit that's hard is the having the courage and the bravery to move forward and potentially change. And I think change is really scary for people. But I find that once we get past that little scary hump, it's super worth it.
Hmm. Yes. Yeah. So I think it's a kind of a push for people to look at like you can do it in many different ways. You work on your life. There's no one particular way that you have to do it. You don't have to go to therapy forever and ever. You can
No.
actually have different techniques that you learn about and get I don't know, experienced in, or someone helps you through these experiences of this technique, and then feel this freedom maybe that gets something gets lifted off your shoulders, so you get to be have a different experience of your world.
Absolutely. And we might revisit it at different points, right? So we might first come to therapy if we use the analogy of a car because our transmission fell out. And so we do some really deep work for a little bit. And then we're like, oh, the car's running. It's going well. And then we go on our life. And then, maybe a few years later, we're like, oh, those brakes are making a clicking sound. Huh, maybe I want to go back and work on this thing. And so I think there's this idea that like if I start therapy, I'm going to be in it forever and I have to work on all the things. And it's like, no, come with a goal, work on just what you need to and feel like you want to at that moment. And then know that it's okay to pause and go live your life without therapy, because that's really the goal. I think, as a therapist, I'm like, we're going to say hello, but we also need to know when are we going to say goodbye? And knowing that whenever you choose to say goodbye is okay.
Right. So it's almost like get the tools you need. This is one of my mottos that I used on my website for many years was get the tools you need and go back out and live your life, you know.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah,
then yes, they might come up again. There might be like there's a deeper thing because that thing came back. And
absolutely. Yeah.
I didn't catch the deeper thing. I was able to ride on the first chapter one work
Yeah,
that we did on it, but now I need to work on the next chapter because it's reoccurring. So
absolutely.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think that's really important because a lot of times people have that perception that I'm going to be in therapy for 100 years. And instead
Yes.
it's like, yeah, say hello, but also let's figure out when we're going to be saying goodbye. Like when are we going to you would have felt like what's the visual of you feeling like you can walk out of this relationship for a while.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm. Great. Well, it's always great to have these back and forth conversations because I know you're really experienced and we, both of us have been working in the field for a long time. So it's always nice to think what's the latest thing, what's the next thing, what's the next way that you and I are discovering to talk about it because the field's so organic, right? So it changes and shifts so much.
Yep.
Uh,
And just like our clients, right? We have to change and shift with it.
Right, right. So that's the other piece is the therapist has to evolve and the
Uh,
therapist has to keep their training going and learn more and work on themselves more to be the therapist that can hold people in all these different ways. So I think that's the gift about the field is that you're like we're constantly almost like the experiment.
yeah.
Our lives are also
Absolutely.
the experiment. Can we grow and change and evolve? Yes, we can. So
Yeah.
therefore we can be a model to other people doing that and show them the way of how to do it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love it. It's a great recipe.
Thank
So,
you.
well, thanks for being here today. Let's hope we all get through the day and make sure that we're not too triggered by our past, um, and keep moving forward in this world that's also evolving all around us all the time. Thanks, Holly.
Yeah. Thanks, Susan. Bye.